Hello, everybody. My name is Aerin. This is my co-author, Sarah. We are from Carnegie Mellon University, and we are here to tell you why people don't use password managers effectively. Before I start our presentation, I just want to ask the audience, how many of you are currently using a password manager? Please raise your hand if you do. Wow, I see a lot of hands raised. That is fantastic. We're doing so much better than the average Americans. Well, this is not so surprising. We are this group who are really keen on security and privacy. Passwords are indispensable to people's online lives. There's a lot of articles in the news media and many security professionals that recommend password manager software as the best way to store and create a random generated password for each of your accounts. But despite all these efforts, the adoption rates remain low. The Pew Research Center conducted a survey on 2016 asking how Americans are keeping track of their passwords. And their results show that only 18% are saving their passwords with internet browsers, and only 12% are using a password management program. And among these 12%, merely 3% are using it as their primary method. So password managers have been around for more than 10 years. We, as researchers, really wanted to know why aren't people using them despite all the benefits? The prior work tried to answer this question using free response questions in surveys. The term password managers are usually left undefined, leaving it to participants' own interpretations. But we do think it is important to distinguish the built-in password managers, like the password saving features in Chrome and Keychain, versus the separately installed password managers like 1Password and KeePassword, and LastPass and KeePass. Because password can show that people use those tools differently. There's a study in USENIX last year by Lastani et al., which showed that users of built-in password tend to reuse their password more and use weak passwords than users of separately installed tools like 1Password. But there were not a lot of work trying to explore why that is the case, so which leads to us to our second research question. Among existing users of password managers, why aren't they using them ineffectively? So here, when we mention ineffectively, we're talking about people just conveniently store their weak and reused password in the password managers, or they pick a weak and reused password as their master password. So our work is influenced by Stober and Biddle's paper on the password lifecycle. So we conducted 30 semi-structured interviews, as those interviews give us the flexibility to go into details when needed. Especially people tend to have complex and different password management habits and choices. So we spent a lot of time developing interview scripts, which is based on 9 pilot interviews with real participants. Each interview takes about 1 hour, and participants were paid $30 for it. Sarah and I applied inductive coding to the interview transcriptions. So the interview contained questions related to the general usage of their internet accounts and passwords, the strategies for password creation and composition, their participants' password management habits, their attitudes regarding password management and generation tools, as well as their experience with account compromise. So we applied purposive sampling for recruitment, and to ensure that we have participants with a variety of different password management strategies, as well as with different occupations. So we ended up with 3 types of users. The first group contains 9 individuals who do not use any password-specific tools. There are 12 who use tools that built into browsers or operating systems. 7 participants reported using separately installed tools. There are 2 oddball users with unusual strategies that are difficult to categorize. Among the group of users who do not use any tools, instead, some simply memorize passwords in their heads. Some write down passwords or hint their passwords on a notebook or Post-it notes next to their computers. Some people are more organized. They store a list of all of their online passwords in unencrypted computer files like a Word document or a .txt file. Some prefer to have their passwords on the go, so they store their list in a note-taking app on their smartphones. And others applied more ad hoc methods, like sending themselves voicemails or emails containing their passwords. And some just give up remembering their own passwords. They usually have their accounts logged in and just repeatedly resetting their passwords when needed. So among these participants, their password habits are generally very risky. There are 7 who pretty much use the same password for all of their accounts with slight modifications like a different symbol or number. And there's 1 participant who do not use full passwords, but heavily reuse substrings. And there's 1 who had mostly unique passwords, but the passwords were very simple, usually in the form of a word plus a number, which therefore highly guessable. So when we asked people in this group what they think of their current way of managing their passwords, many of them were not satisfied. Some wished for a solution, and they were not aware of existing password management tools. There's 1 participant who carries around a printout list of all of her 90 passwords in her purse with her. She said, "I really wish there was an easier way to remember passwords, like a universal type of system." Many complain about having problems accessing accounts, especially when they're away from their nodes or they do not have their list handy. Some participants think their current methods are very disorganized, and some mentioned how they like the ability to organize their password alphabetically or by category. It seems that some features of password managers, like syncing or sorting, can be extremely appealing to some people in this group. So we identified the following barriers to adopting password tools. The first is, like I said in the previous slide, people not aware of options. Some people just simply do not know that those tools existed. And the second barrier is that some people do not understand where the prompts asking to save their passwords come from. When they see the prompts, they're wondering, who is asking me? Is it the website, the browser, or my computer? And there's also some confusion about the Remember Me option on the website. Some people think by clicking this option, the browser would remember their passwords. But when they found out their passwords were not saved, they think that this function is not working as expected, therefore losing trust in the browser's ability to save their passwords. Some people who do not use password tools because they think they do not have enough to protect. Either they do not have enough online accounts, or they think that their accounts are not valuable enough to require a tool. They think they're a small fish in a big pond. And for people who are more familiar with password managers, there are various concerns about the security of them. They're not sure whether they can trust the tool, especially when it's not from a well-known company. And they're also wondering what will happen to their passwords or who will have access to their passwords once they adopt the tools. Single point of failure is another big concern. They're worried about storing all of their passwords in one place. If the hacker gets access to their password manager, the hacker would have access to all of their passwords. Some are also afraid of losing or forgetting their master password, therefore losing access to all of their passwords. Some participants who tried but had negative past experience with the tools were reluctant to use them again. There's 1 participant, she recalled losing passwords stored in her work after the IT team updated her browser. Okay.
All right, thank you, Aerin. So we also interviewed 12 people who were using built-in password management tools. That includes password saving features in the browser, like in Google Chrome, and it also includes tools built into operating systems, for example, Apple's keychain functionality. And in many cases, those 2 types of tools are integrated, so a user, for example, might save a password in Safari, and that password might then be propagated through iCloud Keychain to their other macOS and iOS devices. Among these users, the password habits were generally also pretty insecure. About half of them reported heavy reuse of passwords, and many of the others reported strategies to mitigate password reuse. They knew that reusing the same password for every single site was not a good idea, but they didn't know a way to actually have unique passwords for all sites. So they would do things like reusing passwords in tiers. Maybe they had a strong password that they used for important accounts like bank accounts, and then they had weaker passwords that they reused on other types of sites. And in some cases, they would have a unique password for important accounts, but they would have a throwaway password for accounts that they considered less important. Only one user made an effort to have unique and randomly generated passwords for all of her newly created accounts, and she was a special case, so we'll come back to her in a moment. Among these users, they did overall think that these browser and operating system-based tools were really convenient. Everyone loved autofill. They said autofill is awesome. On the other hand, they were often afraid of other people having access to their saved passwords. And especially, they were concerned about other users of their devices and other people with physical access to their computers. So we heard a lot of stories, for example, about worrying about kids ordering things from parents' Amazon accounts. That's scary when you know that the kids can get into your stuff. Almost all of these users adopted these tools due to seeing prompts and due to general concerns of convenience. None of them told us, I started saving my passwords in Google Chrome because I thought that was the more secure thing to do, and that was the most important thing to me. They said things like, it just kind of popped up, and it sounded much easier. So we examined barriers to using these tools effectively. And one of the main things we found was that a lack of experience with account compromise was keeping people from, for example, using the password generation features in the browser-based tools that do offer that option. Many of them knew that their habits were not secure, but they didn't think they would change them unless something bad happened to them. One person told us, sometimes we humans need to get kicked in the ass before we realize that we need to do things differently. Some of them just had a lack of awareness or knowledge of password management and best practices, a lot like the users who weren't using any password management tools. And some of them had also considered using third-party or separately installed tools to have more secure password habits, but they were worried about using a tool from an unfamiliar company. So I mentioned we would come back to the user who was actually generating unique passwords in a browser. She was using Safari. So she was an example of someone who previously had not had secure password habits because she just didn't think it was worth it until something bad happened to her. And then something did. So on Thanksgiving, she was having dinner with her family, and she got a call from Macy's that someone had tried to purchase hundreds of dollars worth of shoes or something along those lines from her accounts. And then she got a call from her bank that one of her cards had been compromised. And then she got another call from a bank. And it turned out what had happened was she had her Macy's account compromised, and she was using that password for tons of other websites, including multiple bank accounts. And she said it was awful, so I'm having to get a new debit card for everything, having to get new credit cards. It was just terrible, and that's when I changed every single password that I had to random digits. So this kind of experience seems to be powerful, but it would really be better if people didn't have to have this kind of experience to start using more secure practices. We also interviewed 7 people who were using separately installed password management tools. So those are tools that are not built into browsers or operating systems, tools that must be installed as separate applications or browser extensions. So those are the tools like 1Password and LastPass. And we also interviewed one user of KeePass, which is open source. Among these users, as we might expect from past work, their password habits were more secure overall. All of them used randomly generated passwords for newly created accounts. And most of them used unique passwords for newly created accounts. There was one user who still didn't trust the tool to remember his passwords, so he had several different randomly generated passwords that he reused. All but one of them used a unique master password. Some of them used passphrases, and some of them used randomly generated ones but it sounded like most of them had reasonably strong master passwords. Among these users, as we might expect, there were a lot of positives. One user told us, I can have very long, very complicated passwords for every single website I use, but I only have to remember one. So they did like being able to generate random and unique passwords without having to memorize them. Many of them also liked syncing and portability, although some of them were concerned that that was a security risk. Some of them also mentioned that they liked being able to have their passwords on the go and have access their password manager on their phone. On the other hand, many of them reported usability and compatibility issues. One of them just told us the app sucks. She said that the password manager worked okay in her browser on her computer, but she found the app incredibly frustrating because she felt that it would sometimes suggest a password for a different website when she was trying to log into another website, and she just found it really difficult to use. And that was pretty prevalent among these users. They would say things like, well, it saves passwords. The user experience is frustrating. They also reported that initial setup was a lot of work. So people would have a really hard time going from having passwords that they were storing some other way, in many cases passwords that were reused, and having to spend hours or days transferring all of those passwords into the new tool, and in many cases generating new passwords. Some of them also worried about forgetting their master passwords, and some of them just lived with that worry, but some of them chose to do things that might not have been very secure, including one person who kept hers saved all the time in an email draft. So why are password manager adoption rates so low? And what could we do about it? First of all, there's a lack of awareness of password management tools, and many users also don't think they're at very high risk of account compromise. We think that there's plenty of room for more advertising and education. Many users also mentioned to us that one of their main sources of information about password best practices was the guidelines on the password creation page on a website. So that might be a place where users could be nudged to do things like using a password management tool. And we also did confirm here that browser prompts tend to nudge people to choose better password practices as long as those nudges make sense to users. It also seems that it would be important to emphasize useful features. Some of these users are never going to have security as their primary concern. Convenience is going to win for many of these users. But given that we had users, for example, who really liked storing their passwords in a file because they could alphabetize it or sort it by category, we should let these users know that in many cases a password manager can do things like that and can do it with even more power. Confusing prompts were also an issue that caused people to not trust password management tools or not understand them. So it's important to do research with non-expert users to identify those points of confusion and to improve website interfaces and browser prompts so that people trust those tools. Usability and reliability problems were an issue. It's important to do usability testing with non-expert users. And in particular, we need to do more long-term studies to reveal edge cases, because when users, when a password manager essentially remembers passwords on most websites, but users find it doesn't work on certain websites, they stop trusting it and they resort to less secure practices. And why don't people use password managers effectively, and what can we do? Users of built-in tools often prioritize convenience over security. We should improve the reliability of these tools so that users trust them, and then we can nudge users to generate passwords, but they're unlikely to do this in built-in tools until they trust the tool to reliably retrieve their passwords. And users of separately installed tools seem to have better outcomes, but they still show risky behaviors sometimes. And the main places where that might be able to be addressed are streamlining the initial setup, because we had some users who reported they just gave up there, and help users create, memorize, and understand how to store their master passwords in a safe way. so that they don't resort to insecure practices or just give up at that step. So deterrents to password manager adoption include lack of awareness, risk assessment issues, confusing prompts, and usability and reliability issues. And effective use of password managers requires usability and convenience, especially for built-in tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. I mean, just keep it up. You know,
Sure.
This is fantastic. Some of the recommendations that you gave are, at least have been for us, contradictory. The streamlined setup, we find that a barrier. We used to have things during setup to help people memorize, choose, you know, and learn good master passwords. And you know, so we found we've had to choose between those two in many ways. I don't know, I'm just, thank you.
It's a difficult problem. Yeah, we identified problems and we know we don't have solutions for all of them.
Hi, Boke from UBC. Thank you so much for this. This was quite interesting. I was wondering if you did a comparison, if there are differences between the reasons why people don't use password managers and the surveys that already exist. Were there any differences between those reasons and this one?
In many cases, what we found confirmed and added detail to some of that past work. One of the things that we think was novel were these issues that multiple people reported about being confused about where password manager prompts come from, like thinking the website was trying to save their password, as well as issues with thinking that the remember me function on a website was somehow related to a password manager. But in many other cases, we were just confirming and adding more depth to what people had observed before.
Thank you for a good talk. Avas Rashid from University of Bristol. I thought it was quite interesting to see the different contrasts, but I also wondered if you saw any practices where users didn't actually fall into those three neat categories. So for instance, did you see people who, for example, are using browser-based password managers also then using some of the other practices of the users that actually don't use anything?
Yeah, and here we categorized users based on what their primary strategy was, but there were certainly people across all of these groups who were using a mix of strategies in at least some cases. And we also, as we mentioned, had a couple of users that were doing something completely different that they categorized as a security by obscurity approach that we didn't even get into.
So it would be interesting to know if people were using mixed strategies, then were there strategies which were for more secure things that they perceive more secure, and then there are things where they don't care and they do things like that. But you know, maybe we can talk afterwards.
And there's a little bit about that in the paper, but I agree there's probably something interesting there in terms of how people decide what strategy to use for some accounts versus using a different strategy for other accounts.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little to that, is that the first group tend to have more, they tend to apply more methods than like, you know, the last group. The last group, they just use the third party and they don't need to use anything else. But for the first group, they tend to apply a variety of different, like some keep their passwords on a node or some just use browser to save it. So they tend to use more mixed methods than the last group.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Should move my laptop, huh?